Hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Merkel. Welcome to Sports Stories, the podcast. This Sports Gator podcast will discuss different stories that we as humans have experience in, with, and through sports, hopefully providing context to the following questions. What makes sports so special? And how do sports impact us as humans? I'll dive headfirst into these questions through some critical conversations with a wide variety of guests on the show. With my current background in research and academia, I'll be looking to bridge the gap between practicality and research. I truly hope you enjoy the show. Thank you. All right, everybody. Welcome to episode 18 of Sports Stories, the podcast. My name is Nathan Merkel. This is going to be a very unique episode. I'm really excited about this one. This is actually going to be a recap on all of the episodes I've done this year. My podcast, Sports Stories, initially began last year. April 6th was the first episode when it dropped. And initially started off as rebuilding the Ivory Tower. And that specific title name, I got a little curious, and I guess I had some issues with the title name, just because a lot of times that I would describe the podcast or the episode to people or to fans or to friends and family, nobody would really understand or know what the Ivory Tower was and what I'm trying to rebuild. And so in terms of branding and in terms of marketing, for those out there that are interested in getting into that sort of realm of business or any sort of venture like that, it's very important that when you start a business or start a platform like a podcast, that when you market it or you talk to people about it, that people are going to know what your product is just by the name that you share. That's very influential and helpful in terms of marketing and branding. I know there's a lot of companies out there right now that don't necessarily have that. But in terms of feasibility and just cultural understanding, it's a lot easier to market your product if people know what it is you're telling them before you have to, without even having to explain it to them. So that is one reason why my podcast, it started off as Rebuilding the Ivory Tower, Perspectives on Sport and Society. That quickly changed because it's a mouthful. As you can imagine, it was a lot of word coming at you, basically just for a title and an episode. So I switched it to Sports Stories. I think it switched after episode like 4 or 5, something like that. And I switched it to Sports Stories, the podcast, because I wanted it to be very, very simple and very straightforward. So that way people knew exactly what it is I was doing, what I'm trying to accomplish here. And within the first year, I've had a lot of trials and tribulations with trying to run this podcast while also pursuing my PhD. So that's been a mountain to climb in and of itself. But I'm actually going to go through this episode. I'm going to keep doing it every year as like a final recap of the year in terms of episodes. And so this first year, it started off as my first year doing a podcast. I've never done any sort of media related ventures before. And so this was a new opportunity for me to learn and understand how to create podcasts and how to interview people and bring people on as guests and just have a conversation with them. And it has opened my eyes a lot to different nuances and skills that people require as podcasters and just interviewers to begin with. And so I have a lot of respect now for people that do this on a daily basis, because it's kind of hard to record your voice and record an episode every day with new content and all the amount of time it takes to record and plan and then program and then engineer the episodes and market it and brand it and all these things. So if anybody out there is interested in starting a podcast, please feel free to message or reach out, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what it looks like and what it takes, both monetary and just physical time spent. So I'm going to start off going just episode by episode and giving a brief rundown of all the episodes that I've done and doing a recap of them. And then that'll be it. And that'll be the start of season 2 of Sports Story the Podcast. So, excuse me. So episode 1 initially began, which is actually on my analytical platform that I use, Riverside. Riverside is a really cool platform where I can record and post all of my content to all of the platforms. According to that Riverside analytics, the very first episode is actually the most viewed, which is really interesting because it was with my father. Um, we talked about franchise betrayal and franchise relocation. The reason why I find it so interesting that it's the most viewed is because we just used Zoom and had no plans whatsoever about the content of the episode. We just got on, recorded, and talked for an hour about how relocation sucks. And um, that has now been the most viewed out of all the episodes I've done, and it's really cool to see. I think, I don't know, not a lot of people have told me why maybe it is, and my theory is that it's just extremely authentic in terms of episodes and content, because it's just me and my dad talking about real things and talking about sports and why we should care about it and how it's helped and impacted us. And so the episode talked a lot about the emotional fallout of franchise relocation, and how when teams move from one city to another, even though a lot of teams nowadays are doing it to drive revenue, not a lot of franchises take into account the emotional damage that it has on fans. And so, with the current landscape right now of the NFL, with the Chiefs moving either to somewhere else in Chicago or to Indiana or somewhere, the Bears moving out of Chicago and somewhere else, the Chiefs moving 40 minutes west into the state of Kansas. Um, and the recent teams like Oakland leaving to go to Las Vegas, and then Arizona Coyotes leaving Arizona to go to Utah to be a new Utah Mammoth team. So all of these occurrences of relocation is very prevalent in our society right now, and it's really crazy to me how teams and ownership are just threatening to leave and threatening to relocate in order for the public, the taxpayer, to pay more for their stadium subsidies. And so, one thing that is really interesting is the Chiefs, they're using what's called a star bond, which is a sales tax and revenue bond, which you don't technically pay that up front. What you pay is the extra tax that's already implemented at the event. So, like when the new stadium is built, they're going to be using public funds already to build that. And then when the stadium is built, they're going to bring events into the stadium, and the taxes that get generated from that event will then be siphoned back to the public to pay off that bond and to pay off that bill. And so that's where the sales tax and revenue comes from, the star bond. But what's really intriguing is that this star bond, I'm pretty sure, is valued at 1.2 billion, which is an aggressive amount of money to pay back. And I just don't know how feasible that is to pay back 1.2 billion in sales tax, and I think there's only 2 teams that I'm pretty sure that were successful in paying back their star bonds, and that was one, the Dallas Cowboys. I think theirs was like 500 mil. And granted, this is, Jerry Jones in Dallas, where they have in a very, very large city, a large market cap in Dallas to bring in events and all these things to drive revenue and sales tax. And then Minnesota, I think they had 200 mil, something like that, for the Vikings in the stadium in Minneapolis. And so, but the thing is double, basically triple both of those. And now you're getting at what the Chiefs are having to pay with 1.2 billion in the star bonds. So it's a totally aggressive amount of money that is being required for people to sort of pay in tax when they attend games and all these things and ticket prices and all that sort of stuff. So the second part of that episode, we talked a lot about the trauma of franchise relocation. And so I know there might be a lot of people out there that have experienced franchise relocation. And it is unfortunately one of those phenomenons that is going to keep happening in the US and is almost sort of foreign in Europe. I would argue it probably never, ever happen ever in Europe. And I've asked a lot of friends and coworkers and colleagues that are stationed in Europe or overseas outside of the US. And I asked them, I'm like, well, do you ever think there's a chance that franchise relocation could occur in Europe? And they kind of laugh at me at the concept because um, ownership and the style of ownership is drastically different overseas than it is in the US. And so um, the fact that it's so commercialized, and I think just due to the capitalistic nature of the US, ownership in the US is franchise based. And so private owners can basically do what they want with their team. And we saw that with the Rams. Like Stan Kroenke bought land in California and was like, hey, the Rams suck. we're moving. And it's basically what he said, for lack of a better word or phrase or scenario there. He bought land and then he broke the rules and bylaws in the NFL and relocated. And actually, St. Louis sued him for, I think it was 600 mil. And so even though he paid out the 600 mil payout to the city, like, he doesn't care because now he's, I think, the most highly valued franchise in the entire world. So now when we think like 10 years have gone by since the St. Louis Rams have left the city of St. Louis, and the conversation with my father is really interesting, where we still sort of struggle and have a lot of animosity towards professional sports, just because I think of the fact of how the ownership model is in the U.S. and where things are going. As we can see in the NFL, a lot of teams are moving. Same with the MLB and the NHL. Teams are just hopping from one city to another in order to drive this like crazy thing that Stan basically started, is building this wild compound and complex that has so much money being coming in, and in hopes to drive economic revenue. But in terms of what's really interesting in terms of economic stimulus, there's so much research out there that just building a stadium doesn't drive revenue. And so I think there's a current disconnect between what the fans and the community want versus what private ownership and what business wants. So that was episode number 1. Episode number 2 talked about the Australian invasion into the NCAA. So I talked with a previous University of Illinois punter. His name was Hugh Robertson. He was actually a police officer in Australia and came over in his late 20s to be a punter for the University of Illinois. And there's an organization called ProKick that creates and develops punters and kickers in Australia to play in the NCAA. And so that's why we actually see about 50% of all punters and kickers in the NCAA are Australian. And that's why it's probably coming not as a surprise to you now, but when you see their names and you see countries of origin of punters and kickers, you can be like, wow, there's a lot of Australians now. I wonder why. Well, now you know it's because there's an organization called ProKick that their sole reason they exist is to create punters and kickers and ship them over to the U.S. to come and play NCAA football. So that conversation was really interesting to hear the different styles of sport. In Australia, it's very community driven, where Hugh said a lot of the sport that he grew up in was provided by the community, and it was usually free to play. There's a lot of grassroots initiatives where it was sort of holistic and generally building, whereas here in the U.S., as we know, it's getting farther and farther away from grassroots efforts and more into privatization. And there's a lot of private youth sports and private leagues that are paywalled and require a large amount of money just to join and play. So it's really unfortunate where that's going. But then the last talking point from that episode is the visa, international visas, the student visa, and NIL. When an individual comes into the U.S., they're usually on a visa. In terms of us being a student, I think it's a J1 visa, a J1 or an F1 student visa, and the stipulations of that visa is that individuals that are on this citizenship style cannot work while in the U.S. And so that places a lot of issues for athletes in terms of the NIL. And so when you look at NIL deals, there's a lot of international athletes that are struggling to land NIL deals because it's actually considered work to get revenue for giving your name, image, and likeness and doing marketing and branding. And that would actually violate their visa, and that would then cause them to then be um, an illegal, basically violate the visa, and it would ex-nay their visa, and they would then be considered illegal. And there's a chance that they could get deported or have issues with citizenship. And so there's a lot of problems with international students obtaining NIL money. And so it creates this disparity between domestic students and international students, because domestic students here in the US, we have the availability to go and do NIL deals when and where we want, but international students are really struggling to figure out how to create their platform and drive revenue, because you can't technically work on a J1 student visa. So that's where a lot of departments are getting very creative with their NIL deals. Then the next episode was episode number 3. This one I did with actually an old student classmate of mine at the University of Central Missouri. His name is Brian McQueen. He's the equipment manager for the Maine Mariners in the ECHL. This one, we talked a lot about life working in sports, and if we want to study, or why should we study sports or not. And so working in sports and the sports schedule is really interesting. When we talked a lot about the sort of unfortunate mirror image of working in sports. Usually the regular schedule that you have is going to be 8 to 5 or 9 to 5. That's usually a normal full-time hour schedule. But when you work in sports, it's actually flipped on its head, because when you work 9 to 5, every sporting event is planned and scheduled in order for you to go after the 9 to 5. And so that's usually when, you have games at 6, 7, 8, 9 o'clock, or on Saturdays when you're off. But the problem of working in sports is that you're working those games. That is your job. And so now when people are working 9 to 5, you normally are kind of not, depending on when the season is. And so you're actually flipped. You're working when they're not, and they're not working when you are. And so when you're working at for a professional sporting event, people are coming to you when they're off work. And so now you're working when people are off. And so when you're off, people will probably be working. So that's sort of the disparity between working in sports. And it's kind of tough sometimes to generate friends in social groups, because you're normally off work when people are on, and you're on when they're off, all this sort of stuff. So it's really interesting to think about. And we talked a lot about the reason why we want to study sport management. We talked a little bit about how currently there's a push for sport management programs be put into the business department, just because, as you probably have noticed, the large amount of business and sponsorship and revenue that's being driven into the sport industry right now. I'm pretty sure it's like a $4 billion industry as we're sitting here right now. And so after working in the industry, the sport industry, for 5 years, I can tell you that it was mostly 90 to 99% of my job was to figure out how to drive revenue. And then the second part of that is what are the things that I can do to drive revenue? That is when you get into the social aspect of it, of like well-being and creating fan loyalty and creating inclusive environments and things like that. It's actually not flipped. So currently, I would argue a lot of sport organizations and sport teams and sports-based organizations focus more on driving revenue first, and then after figuring out how to drive revenue, that's when they focus on the social issues and the community engagement and things like that. And it's actually not flipped. So that is where we talked about, well, maybe should sport management, the degree, should it always be in the business department, because that's what the jobs are doing. That's what they're focusing on. And so currently that's one of the biggest debates in sport management and in the discipline is, should we focus on social issues? Should we focus on business? And it just depends on the university that you go to and what the faculty believe in. So So that was episode number 3. Episode number 4, I spoke with a previous professional goalie for FC Tulsa. His name is Michael Creek. The episode name is "So You Want to Be an Athlete." I actually grew up with Michael. Um, we went to high school together, and what's really funny is I haven't talked to him in probably 10 years, and then I reached out to him for this episode, and we recorded it and did it, and it was great. It was probably one of my favorite episodes. We talked a lot about athlete identity, and what it takes to be a professional athlete, and how that sort of affects you holistically. And the interesting thing we discussed is there's a danger of solely identifying yourself as an athlete and athlete only. And if athletes only think of themselves as athletes, then on-field performance becomes a necessity, and it becomes your metric, your measurement of success or failure. And so when you do succeed on the field, you think you're succeeding in life. And when you fail on the field, then you think you're failing off of the field, which creates a crazy amount of stress on athletes and crazy amount of anxiety on athletes, which is why when I was speaking to Michael, I asked him, I said, do you see yourself as athlete first? And he actually is a very religious man. And he said, I'm actually a man of Christ first, then athlete second. And so what's really interesting is it actually takes the failure away, and the anxiety away, because you know that you're human and humans fail. That's just what we do. We're not perfect. And being okay with that failure shouldn't drive um, the way you feel about yourself and the way you sort of operate just on a daily basis. And the next thing we spoke about was how in the current structure of the NCAA, with the internationalization of it. And I played at a lower level in the NAIA, but a majority of the opponents and players that I played with were international. And so it was really interesting that NCAA soccer, if you actually look at men's and women's rosters, there's a lot of international students that play, which sort of, in my mind, begs the question of like, okay, well, why is it that on a professional platform, why is it that our men's World Cup team isn't maybe performing the way that it should? Well, um, basically the highest level of semi-pro league we've got is the NCAA, where a vast majority of the athletes are not from the US. And so that actually creates a sort of barrier, a competitive barrier, for domestic athletes to grow, because there's already international athletes playing there. And so how can they sort of penetrate that market when there's a ton of international athletes taking their spot? So it's kind of like hindering us as a growth machine to even grow to begin with, which is really interesting to me. Um, and then the last one we talked about is something him and I share, is the reality of concussions. And concussions are a very serious thing, and a very serious injury. One of the things that him and I talked about is the recovery process, and how athletes are almost sort of encouraged to lie about mental health in order to sort of fix that athlete identity that they have. And I can tell from firsthand experience, and I know Michael can say this as well. If you avoid the consequences of concussions, it will hinder you down the road. Because I do know when I had to quit playing, I got a few concussions during my spring semester, and the doctor told me that if I kept playing and kept getting concussions, I'd have long-term issues like memory problems. And one of the side effects that I do have right now from getting so many concussions is I actually have sometimes of a problem of recollection, of recalling things. But once somebody says that thing exists, then I can remember it. But initially, I can't recall it. But once somebody says like, "Oh yeah, we did this," and then I think, "Oh yeah, we did," and then it helps. And so that's one of the downsides, and that's like just a very minor side effect. But if we got athletes like that play football or soccer or hockey, all these things, getting concussions all the time, that's when those side effects start to really show. That's where we've seen in the past with CTE and all these things coming in. So if you have a concussion, treat it seriously. I highly recommend being serious about your mental health. So Um, Episode 5 was with a friend of mine at the CrossFit gym. His name is Tyler. Tyler Hill. He works for the local news station here in Champaign. Um, we titled that one "You Want a Subscription with That?" And so we talked a lot about just the media landscape and where that is right now, and how networks are kind of. I had this theory with I think it was with my family a week ago. We were eating dinner or something like that, and I was like, I feel like at some point we're now going from cable, where with cable television and media, to streaming platforms, which was great when it originally started, but now with the way that sports are so, it's being like individually privatized and individually organized. So each streaming platform has a different sports league and a different team. And so you'll see like the MLS is only partnered with Apple TV. And Paramount Plus has CBS and the Europa League and the Champions League. Whereas I think Fox has a lot of the NFL, or then TBS maybe has the NHL. And so now we've gotten to this point where so many sports are on so many different streaming platforms that you have to buy so many different streaming platforms in order to just watch maybe one game or one sport. And so it begs the question of like, okay, well, beforehand we paid this X amount of money for cable, which could get you every single sport and every game. But now we're at the point of how many streaming platforms we have to pay. Netflix to get games. Amazon does football now. Paramount Plus does soccer and NFL now too. Hulu has live sports, all these things, all these platforms. So we have to pay all these platforms. And then at what point does it cost the same to just pay for cable? What's the difference? And so that's sort of something that we talked about. And another thing we talked about too is he's noticing that there's currently a death of long form or long term media consumption, and I think this is due to the rise in TikTok and shorts and media reels and highlight clips. Um, in the past, like maybe 10 to 15 years ago, I would see myself being very comfortable sitting down on my couch and watching a sports game from minute zero to minute final, to final whistle. I could watch it all the way through. But now I would argue, for the listeners out there, I would argue, try to think about the last time you sat on your couch and watched from minute zero all the way to the final whistle without your phone, without any sort of background thing, any sort of side conversation, any sort of side thing, just watching the game through and through for the game itself, without having to hit your parlay, without having to hit the bets you placed, all these things. And so that's this sort of concept, is we're actually getting so far away from that now when you sit to watch a game, think to yourself, like, what am I watching when I sit down and watch this game? I've got my phone up, probably my tablet over here. I've got my tablet with all the bets that I placed on the league. I got my phone with the other game that's going on, that's got my other bets, and I've got the other game going on. And so you're like watching 20 different games at the same time. And it's like this 30-second sort of short clip. And that's what they're starting to notice on the news. And that's when you'll probably see on a lot of news stations, they don't really show long form sports highlights anymore. Like ESPN, it's mostly just short 30-second clips. This is what they're doing. Boom, 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 and getting you through, because we know that our attention span has kind of gone to shit over the last 10 years, which is really funny. And then the next episode is episode 6. This is with Mary Long. This is actually a previous student at the University of Illinois who worked for the department in athlete development. She now works for Columbia University in New York in the Ivy League. The title is More Than Muscle. So we talked about athlete development, and this goes very hand in hand with episode number 4. And the development of athletes off of the field. And so her job at Columbia is to develop athletes off of the field and help them holistically grow as a human and not just as an athlete. And so oftentimes athletes, college athletes, or just athletes in general, lack personal agency. So when I say personal agency, this means that Think about your athletic schedule. Think about your daily routine and your daily schedule. How much of that schedule do you think off the top of your head do you have control over? You know, thinking as an athlete, you probably don't have control over anything, over any of your schedule. The reason is because you have practice, you got games, you got training, you got all these recovery methods. You've got yoga, you've got meals and team bonding exercises. You got homework, you got all this stuff. So, at what point are you able to control your schedule? And so, this unfortunately creates an environment where athletes are almost sort of either afraid or not willing to stand up for themselves and have advocacy for themselves because they're not used to controlling their environment. Because a lot of athletes are used to being told by a coach or an athletic department, you need to show up here for this time, for this practice to do this and this and this. And that sort of takes away personal agency. And that is the responsibility of Mary and other athlete development uh, workers and employees, is to build that advocacy and build that agency so that athletes can stand up for themselves and have a voice themselves without feeling pressure or nervousness. And the last thing we talked about, another thing we talked about in that episode is the increase in cyberbullying, which is really interesting because when based off of the last thing I talked about with Tyler and how you have so many different screens going with probably different bets and all these different things happening at the same time. A lot of people are messaging athletes now upset with their performance because they didn't hit their parlay or because they're not helping them win this bet that they placed on them 5 minutes ago. And so there's actually been an increase in cyberbullying collegiately, in terms of collegially, with now the inclusion of sports betting and gambling in a lot of different atmospheres and arenas. So, which really goes towards helping athletes develop off the field to not allow them to read that and have that focus on performance. Like when I talked with Michael about on-field performance being a metric for a measurement of success, that's exactly what this is getting at. So really interesting to think about. The next episode was really cool episode. Episode 7 was with Coach Ron Likens. This one is awesome episode. I loved doing this episode. If y'all are out there interested in Paralympic sports, I interviewed Coach Ron Likens. He has, this is all off the top of the head. I'm not looking up anything. So he has, I believe, 15 plus gold medals, like a few silver ones, all this sort of stuff, with Paralympic men's and women's basketball. He's like, I think the winningest gold medal winning Paralympic basketball coach in U.S. history. I'm pretty sure. Google and fact check me. But I was able to interview him for episode 7. So that was awesome. We talked about the rise in Paralympic viewership and how the shift of viewership has changed. And so what I mean by that is I would love to ask viewers out there, think this question to yourself, maybe 10 years ago, if I were to show you a clip of wheelchair basketball of somebody doing something really cool, like really, really cool wheelchair basketball athlete doing something awesome, would you think to yourself, wow, that's very inspirational? And be like, wow, that's really cool that they're able to do that given their disability. Would you think that? In my argument, probably 10 years ago, on average, generally speaking, we'd probably be thinking that. But what's really interesting is there's actually been a shift. Recently, in these last couple of years, people are watching adaptive sports like Paralympic athletes, and instead of thinking of it as an inspirational story, they're seeing it as a competitive story instead. So if we were to see somebody like Michael Jordan dunk from the free throw line, you wouldn't think of that as like, wow, he overcame a lot of stuff to do that. That's so cool. No, you see that as a competitive achievement. You're like, wow, that dude is the GOAT, absolute GOAT. But when you see somebody in a wheelchair doing something almost remarkably similar, or some Paralympic athlete doing something remarkably similar. Why is it that we used to think, oh, that's so inspirational? That's where it started to shift, where people are watching Paralympic sports to see the competition within it, because we're starting to realize, like, wow, Paralympic athletes are insane athletes. Like, they are elite athletes. And that's where the shift is coming from, and that's how it's changing. And that's why there's a massive increase over the last few years in Paralympic sports consumption, and why the Paralympic Olympics is on the rise. And so we just saw the U.S. win Paralympic hockey, and that's really cool. The last thing we talked about was the need for PE classes. So I'd love to ask question to you out there, for you to think back to when you were in PE as a kid. Did you ever learn how to play wheelchair basketball? Did you ever learn how to play, I think there's a game, I think it's called netball, I think. I don't know. Fact check me on this, but I think it's for individuals who are blind. They wear a blindfold over their eyes, and they are on their hands and knees on the ground, and they have to smack a ball into the opposing net, and all they have is their hearing to hear where the ball is bouncing and where to dive from that. Like, did you play that? Have you played any other Paralympic form of sports? And my argument is probably not, because when I was in PE, we did a lot of regular able-bodied games, just baseball, kickball, all this sort of fun stuff. But we never really learned about adaptive sports. And so this is where Coach Likens, I asked him, I was like, where do you think we should go? Like, how do we get people more interested? And he was like, well, I think it starts with the kids in PE. Teach them about about wheelchair basketball. Get them in a chair and have them play. Because I think it will open people's eyes to understand how hard it is. Like, think about shooting a basketball when you're in a wheelchair moving. You're moving. As you know, it's hard to shoot a ball when you're running. Like, I airball like every shot that I do when I'm running. I couldn't imagine when I'm rolling in a chair, rolling. How do you, like, that's crazy. Like, that's so much skill is involved in that. And it's really cool. And I would just urge you to think about those things. And maybe that'll change the way you view Paralympic sports in the future. The next episode was with an old colleague of mine at a summer camp, with his name is Matt Durant. This one was about professional fandom for amateur sports. And so I coined it that because he follows amateur sports like they're professional sports. Like how a lot of us are loyal and very dedicated like sports fans to the NFL, the NHL, and all those things. But he doesn't follow any professional organizations or leagues. He follows minor league teams and like really obscure leagues. And he told me he followed one league where it was streamed online, and the coaches would have to put plays that they want to do out to the community, and people would vote on what play they wanted them to do. And the play that got voted the most, the coach would call in and they would do it and they would play it. And so then he follows European football. I think it's the EFL, the European Football League. I think he's like a fan of the Cologne Bombers. I think that's their name. I don't know. Fact check me, Google me on this. This is all coming off the top of the head here. And so it was really interesting to talk to him about why he's so infatuated with minor league teams and amateur sports. We talked about how there's a difference in terms of professional teams and professional sports and minor league teams. So when you go to a professional game, I would urge you to sit there and think, like, how is this game, or how is this team interacting with me as the fan? Are they doing any sort of engagement activities that make me really want to care about being there? My argument, my thought is that a lot of professional teams and organizations don't really do shit during their games. And but what's really funny is minor league teams, when you go to a minor league game, you're sitting there, you're like, wow, this is fun. Like, this is just fun. Like, think of the Savannah Bananas. Like, they're obviously not a professionally, it's not the MLB, but they're also like elite athletes doing some crazy stuff on the field. And one of their rules is if a fan catches a foul ball, the batter's out. Like, that's so cool. Like, that is so cool. It's really interesting how they connect fans and community to the game itself. But with professional teams and leagues, there's really not a lot of like connection between team and fan. It's mostly just, hey, buy the ticket, go spend $100 on a hot dog, go spend $50 on parking, and then come sit in your seat and enjoy the game. But with minor leagues, it's like, okay, well, you bought the ticket. How can we then involve you in everything we do when you get there? Which is really cool and really interesting. I urge y'all out there to go to some minor league games and support your minor league team, and just look at the difference when you're there, and what's the difference between being a fan for this team versus being a fan for a professional team. And you'll sit there and be like, huh, there's a visible difference here. It's really funny and interesting. And last thing we talked about was the flaw of American ownership, which goes into this sort of experience. And so, unlike the community-driven model, like I talked about with Hugh in Australia, or another example is in Germany, there's the Bundesliga, the professional soccer league. There's currently a 50+1 rule. So every single soccer team in Germany is 50% plus one vote owned by the community. And so what that means is majority, that creates majority. So majority ownership is the community. That means that no private owner could come in and make changes to the team without the community's say or voice. So this is where you saw, for those that have watched the Wrexham documentary, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney literally had to get on a Zoom call with like 1,000 Wrexham local community members and pitch to them why they wanted to buy the team, because the Wrexham community actually owns the team. And they had to be like, hey, we want to buy it for this reason. Let us buy it. And they had to convince them. And so it's really interesting to think about, and how in the US, it's all privately owned with basically no say from the community, whereas everybody in Europe, it's community owned. And that is why you see fans in Europe are like super diehard more, because they actually basically own it. And so I would urge you to think about, like, there's only one team in the US that's publicly owned. And they're globally known for being like probably top 5 like most electric atmosphere, and it's the Green Bay Packers. They're actually publicly owned. The team rents the stadium from the city. The city owns the stadium, so the team pays rent to the city to play in their stadium, and it's really cool. It's I wish every other team in the NFL did the same thing. And what's really discouraging is that the NFL actually now has a rule or a bylaw in place that they can't follow the same rule as the Green Bay Packers, because the NFL isn't making money off of the Green Bay Packers because they're not privately owned. But the NFL is making a boatload of money off of every other team. So that's the unfortunate reality of where we're at right now with ownership in America. Episode 9 was with the marketing director for the University of Kansas football team, Allison Kelly. This was another previous classmate of mine at Central Missouri. And we talked about the collegiate sport marketing environment. She runs the marketing program for the football team at the University of Kansas. And she works with a bunch of donors, campus partners, and city officials. And she talked about how marketing rarely relies on academic research, and it mostly relies on coworkers and other professional organizations in the field. And so, which really intrigued me, because I am in academic research, and I'm like, okay, well, how can I find a way to do research that will get people to read it? And, you know, I'll ask this question to y'all out there, like, when's the last time you were thinking about a sport problem or a sport issue, and you're like, oh, let me look at what research says. Let me look at what the academic researchers are saying about this. Hello, no, nobody is doing that ever. So that's sort of one of the goals of this platform and this podcast is to put a voice to sports research. But that's just the nature of it. Is people in the industry don't care about academic research. And one of the things Allison talked about was the emotional payoff of working in college sports. I mean, this I can actually attest to because I worked briefly in college sports too, but she was talking about how working for a university and a college sports team actually gets her more psychologically involved and psychologically connected to the university and to the team rather than working for a corporate sort of business focused professional organization. And so she's actually a lot more emotionally invested to the University of Kansas and a lot more emotionally invested into the students that work for her, a lot more emotionally invested into the students that play, rather than working for a professional team where you're, working for a team that has $1 million athletes that kind of don't really care much at all, but you have students that work there, all this sort of stuff. So she found that working in college sports has a really high emotional return, which is really cool to think about. Next episode 10. Okay, this is actually probably my favorite episode. Before Coach Ron Likens, out of all 17 episodes I've done, this one is probably number one. Episode 10 is my favorite. I highly recommend going and listening to that episode. I'm so grateful I was able to do this. I did this episode with Elisa Graybo. Elisa Graybo is the life coach of Tracy McGrady. And for those who don't know who Tracy McGrady is, Google Tracy McGrady's name. He's a NBA Hall of Famer and is the agent, basically the agent and life coach for Tracy McGrady. And she's helping run the OBL that he's launching, the Ones Basketball League, which is really cool. I got to talk with her for a long time about her life, about her story. It was really cool. Highly recommend going and listening to that and listening to what she has to say. But we talked a lot about, first off, she talked about her experience of not being athletically minded. Like she didn't really grow up like really caring about sports. She actually wanted to go to school to be a psychologist and go to school to get a psychology degree. She kind of just fell into working in agency and sports agency. And I asked her, I was like, do you think not having a large amount of sports understanding or sports knowledge or fandom actually helped you? And what was really cool is she came back and said, yeah, it actually did help me a lot. Because when I was working with these top names, like she worked with Kobe, she worked with, I think, A-Rod, Troy Aikman, a bunch of top names, like a bunch of big names. And she's like, I had no idea who they were. I just thought they were people. They were just tall dudes, just tall men. That's who they are. That's what they are. And that's it. And I was like, oh, I mean, that's really cool because you're not like starstruck, which allowed her to approach this relationship very authentically and not have emotions tied into it, which is one of the problems that she mentioned is that a lot of people that get involved in an athlete's life are unfortunately like yes people, because the athlete gets famous, they get a lot of money, and you sort of create this posse or this crew of people that just want to say yes around you and not actually tell you what's right or wrong or what's bad, what's good for you, like holistically. And that is her job as a life coach for Tracy McGrady. She's there to talk to Tracy and help him through business, life, and all things just sports in general. And so the one of the most important forms of currency, she said, the form of currency is trust. She said that a successful athlete representative is not earning them money is not the most important thing. The most important thing is about building trust and building an authentic relationship for them. And I actually used this like metaphor. I was like, it feels like Elisa is like a or sports agents or life coaches in general. Imagine like you have a pool and you've got this net and you're sifting a bunch of leaves and stuff out of the pool to make the pool more inviting and more, open to swim in. And that is what she does. She takes the net and she sweeps Tracy's brain, Tracy's life, and cleans it and makes it professional and exuberant and all these sort of things. So it's really cool that she's sort of like that gatekeeper for professional athletes, which is awesome. Highly recommend going and listening to that episode. It was super cool. The next episode was with Neil Schwartz, who's the president of SBRnet, which is a sports analytics company. And so we talked about the massive commercialization that's going on with the sport industry and the crazy increase in analytics. And I think Billy Beane would be very excited right now, thinking about where sports is and where analytics is, because everybody in the sport industry is so heavily reliant upon analytics and just data. It's so data driven. It's crazy. And so there's been a crazy corporate takeover of pro sports, where we're creating these premium luxury seats and all these things. So next time you go to a professional stadium, try to count how many suite boxes are there. I was at a Blues game recently, and they've got, I think, 3 levels of suites. They've got one on the lower level, one on the second above that, and one on the very, very top that normally you see like the VP of marketing or VP, the player ops coordinator, all these like front office staff on the very top level. But there's also 2 underneath, and so that is very intriguing to me, because instead of those two floors of suites, you could probably pack in another 5,000 fans. But they took out all those seats in order to sell luxury experiences and create this premium environment, which is, I think in Miami, they have a pool in their stadium. The Raiders have a nightclub and basically a casino and a nightclub in their football stadium. There's a lot more luxury offerings in stadiums nowadays, and so it's really interesting. The last thing also we talked about was data element versus the human element. And so I had this question of like, okay, at what point is there going to be a fall off of analytics? And so analytics is becoming more and more popular, but at what point are we going to stop thinking about the person and stop thinking about the human? Because if anybody's watched March Madness out there, I will bet you $500 billion that I don't have. I'll bet you all the money in the world that no analytical system would ever have doubted or would ever have bet for High Point University, the athlete that scored the final layup. That was his only basket the entire season. Find me an analytical model that would have projected that to happen. Like, based on analytics, that would have never happened. But you take out the analytics and you put out the human element. The coach was like, I need this guy on the court for this specific reason. And he went in and made the layup on the breakaway and scored the final point, and they won the game because of that breakaway. So find me an analytical model that would have projected that. They won't. It doesn't exist. So that's where I urge us to, like, okay, we can use analytics and be happy about analytics, but there's always going to be some form of human element in there, which is really interesting. The next episode 12, this is probably the third of my favorite episodes. Got episode 10 with Elisa, episode 7 with Coach Ron Likens, episode 12 with Darian Cockrell. This is episode 12. This is Stories of a Second Chance. This is a PE teacher in St. Louis who grew up in foster care, was involved in a bunch of bad things, gang-related things, drug-related things. And the moment he started playing football, his life changed. When he played sport, his life changed. He actually got adopted by his coach, and his life changed for the better because of playing football. And now he's a PE teacher in St. Louis, and has won Teacher of the Year, and has been a guest on multiple different talk shows and different platforms. So really cool, awesome episode. Highly recommend listening to that one. one of the main sort of talking points or themes of that episode is that we talked about sports as a vehicle for social change. And so this is the exact, I guess, culmination of a young athlete or an individual who's in trouble in a bad environment, plays football, gets adopted by coach, and then becomes teacher of the year, becomes all these great things solely because of sports. And so this is where you can see and use sports as a vehicle, as a leverage or as a lever for change in society. And so this is going against a lot of things I talked about earlier with the episode with Matt on and my father, and other episodes about the ownership style in the US, about it's getting so privatized. But the thing is like, think of Australia, the model I talked about with Hugh, how it's very community driven and it's available to literally everybody. But now I would urge you to think like right now, try to find a free league that kids can play in. Good luck, because they're all privately owned now in the US. I do know I worked in Memphis. That was the only free sort of programming I ever came across. Is the city offers free programming for kids through the city's public Parks and Rec system, but that also creates its own issues. But using that as a vehicle for social change, great. Love that, and I love the idea of using sports to solve society's problems. And I think that's really cool. Episode 13, this was the solo dolo episode, just with myself, mostly because I was super busy as a PhD student and I didn't know who to have on the show. So I was like, screw it, I'm just going to do it myself. And this was right before, I think literally the day before the Chiefs came out and said, we're moving 40 minutes west. And the Bears came out and said, we're probably moving too. So this was basically just a life story of me, of where I've been in life, how I grew up in sports. I got injured and I've worked in a bunch of different sports environments, ranging from public to private to collegiate to professional sport. And then I just talked about franchise relocation in general, and that's very near and dear to my heart. I talked about how it's currently a threat that billionaire owners are using to force taxpayers and us as the fans to pay for their own stadium. And so if you were to look at the deal that Kansas City just struck with the public in Kansas, there's so many people in Kansas now, they're going to have to pay for that, and not the Hunt family, which is worth like, I don't know, 4 billion, something like that. I don't even know. But it's just really wild and astonishing to me that a billionaire family is leveraging the public, is leveraging fans to pay for their stadium. And so I would personally much rather see them come in and be like, hey, we're going to dedicate 200 mil to renovate Arrowhead in Kansas City and maintain the stadium. Because I think there's a problem with the way that we view stadiums and arenas and events and things like that in the US, compared to like Europe and things like that. So I would argue in Europe, there's probably not a lot of occasions or not a lot of moments where people actually tear down a stadium and build a new one. I know of one right now. AC Milan, my favorite team, is about to tear down San Siro and build a new one. But I actually don't know of any other occasion that do that. Normally, like with Liverpool and Anfield, Camp Nou, with Barcelona, Everton, I think they built a new stadium. That was one that built a new stadium. I'm trying to think, but I can't fully remember. But there's not a lot of occasions where teams will tear down a stadium and build a new one. They actually just renovate, and that is why you actually see a lot of emotional ties to stadiums and a lot of historical relevance with stadiums, and they're more so like monuments in Europe. But in the US, what we've got like 4, maybe like Lambeau Field, Fenway Park, Wrigley Field. What else? Maybe Camden Yards with Baltimore. Maybe those 4, like generally historic stadiums. If you can think of another one, let me know. But I'm pretty sure it's just 4 out of the 500 freaking teams we've got here. It's crazy to me. So episode 14, we're getting near to the end here. Episode 14, this is, I talked with a fellow classmate, a fellow PhD student at the University of Illinois. I talked with Alexia Hammonds. She is a previous owner of a athleisure company, athletic perfume company, and sold her shares and sold her ownership shares of that, and is now pursuing her PhD. And we talked about sort of the drive of entrepreneurship and how it's actually sort of exploded now with the convergence of AI, and how it's so easy for entrepreneurs to just sort of create business revenue and create business opportunities with the help of AI. And it provides non-traditional opportunities for students to obtain education or just a salary in general. And one of the main things we talked about is being strategic about ownership. She said that building a brand requires an immense amount of self-awareness, and finding a gap in the market. And then lastly, learning to separate your emotional attachment from business decisions. And I know how difficult it may be to try to do that and separate emotions from business decisions, because when you create a company from the ground up, you're going to want to place, it's your baby, it's your heart and soul. So having no emotions attached into that will be difficult and will be very hard. But that's what she recommends for those out there that are interested in entrepreneurship. Next one, this was a really cool episode. Episode 15 was with Sterling Harris. I called this one Father, Son, and Holy Touchdown. This is Sterling Harris was a previous NFL athlete, and we talked about the current sort of rise and boom in faith and spirituality in sports. And so this goes back to look at Fernando Mendoza, look at who else? I think it was an athlete. I think it was Miami, the running back. When he scored a touchdown, he hand signaled "God loves you" in sign language. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. But if you were to think back to your memory and think back to the post-game interviews of a lot of different athletes, you're starting to see a trend. And a lot of athletes, the first thing they say is, "I want to give glory to God," and then they go about their performance. And so, recently, that what just happened, Eugenio Suarez in Venezuela, his post-game interview was literally like, "I love God. God did this for us. We love Jesus Christ. He's our Lord and Savior." All these things, said all these things, and then went into the performance. And so this is a really cool phenomenon that I talked to Sterling about, because Sterling runs his own ministry and tries to improve the relationship that athletes have with spirituality. And so we talked to two main talking points. The first one is we talked about the danger of churchianity. And so churchianity is where you're sort of looking at faith and spirituality more in terms of like a checklist, and placing it into a box. And rather than just thinking about an authentic spiritual connection that you have with oneself and with God, and with your faith to begin with. And so it leads to the occasion where Sterling would share, he was like, "Well, there's a lot of athletes on the team that I played with that considered themselves Christians. But after the game would end, we'd all go to the club, all go to the bar, drink a bunch of drinks, do all this stuff, and basically go against everything our faith says." And so this is the sort of divide that he's getting at, is athletes are just doing this to check a box, just to feel good about themselves. Which is really interesting. The last thing we talked about was how the NFL views athletes as disposable employees. And I said that the NFL treats a majority of athletes as disposable property, and that he would love to see some form of CBA in place, a collective bargaining agreement with the NFL Players Association, to alleviate this sort of extreme toxic environment where if someone gets hurt, somebody's in there to take their place. It's a revolving door. There's really no care or long-term care effort in terms of the NFL. So The next episode was episode 16 with Cody and Gary. They run a podcast called Royally Quacked, which is really cool. I named this the State of the League Address. This is going to be a biannual episode with them. We're going to talk about the NHL and why should we care about the NHL. Basically, like how the president gives the State of the Union address. This is going to be the State of the League address, and like why should we care about the NHL? And who cares? Like, let me ask you this question. I'd love for you to think about this on your own. But the fact that we won Olympic hockey, Jack Hughes won the gold medal for us in overtime against Canada. Does us winning the Olympic gold medal encourage you to care more about hockey? The fact that we won gold, have you now watched more NHL games? Have you cared more? Have you been more involved with hockey? So that's this sort of question of like, well, we won gold on this crazy platform. Do people actually care? And that's this question that we tried to tackle. And a couple of main points we talked about is there's actually been a 40% increase in female fans in the NHL. And what's really interesting is that it's solely because a very popular book, a romance novel, came out where the male character is a hockey player. And so now you're having a lot of women reading this romance novel, getting to know hockey from the book. And so now they're starting to watch more hockey. And so there's actually been a 40% increase in female fans because of a romance novel, which is crazy to me. The next thing we talked about is why is it that maybe there's a barrier for people to fall in love with the NHL. And what Gary said is he thinks it's actually the rules, the specific style of hockey and the rules of hockey is actually what creates a barrier. And, when we sit down and watch a game of hockey, it is kind of confusing. Like icing, I never really understood what icing was to begin with. Like, why do they allow fights? All these different things. So it's really interesting to think about. And I think that's what is actually hindering the growth of hockey is hockey itself, is how confusing the rules are. And it's really hard to bring a sports fan to a hockey game and have them like really understand what's going on, because you feel like you have to coach them through everything, which then forces you to not watch the game. You're just coaching your friend on what every rule is. And so it becomes this problem. That's why a lot of people may not watch it, because they just don't get it. They don't understand the rules. And then finally, the last episode of the season, which as in terms of when I'm recording this on March 21st. This episode 17, is going to be coming out next week. So by the time that this episode airs, specifically, this one will come out on April 6th. So by the time this comes out, this episode will be published as well. This episode was with Jordan Harmon. This was a previous classmate of mine in high school. We graduated high school together in 2013. So doing quick maths, that's 13 years ago. That would make, we're, holy crap. I haven't talked to this man in 13 years, which is really funny. But he's a great guy. I messaged him on LinkedIn and we hit it off and started talking. And I did an episode with him. He's the athletic director for Austin Peay State University, a D1 university in Tennessee. And I think he has been named the youngest AD, I'm pretty sure, in the country. I Googled when we were recording that episode, the average age of a collegiate athletic director is 47 to 55. And so he's like 15 years before that, which goes to show how good he is. He's really good at what he does. He's super smart. I highly recommend watching that episode if you're interested in it at all. But we talked about the current state of college sports, and we talked a lot about the rise of the NIL, the rise of the transfer portal. What is it that an AD does? Like, what does he do? What is it that the AD has to rely heavily on? And there's three main talking points from that. We talked about how AI is kind of the new chapter for sports and new chapter for departments. And because I was like, do you see yourself using AI on a daily basis? And he was like, oh, I use it every single day. He was like, from helping me draft an email to helping me draft program plans to all these sort of things to analytical stuff. Like, he uses it all the time. And so I was like, okay, at some point, departments are going to be looking for people that are AI savvy. And he literally said in the episode, one of the first questions that he asks to new employees is, tell me what your relationship is like with AI. So that was really interesting. The next one, I asked him about the transfer portal, and I was like, how do you think you could combat the transfer portal? And he said he believes that building a culture will help alleviate the transfer portal, because as of right now, athletes are transferring because they want more money. But how do you sort of encourage them to stay? And the main reason for that is the culture that you have at the university and the department. And so creating and cultivating and leading this culture is imperative for athletic departments to entice students not to transfer away. And the last thing we talked about, which goes in correlation a lot with the Neil Schwartz analytic episode, the Matt Durant episode, and a couple of other episodes with the human element against the AI and analytics element, and how there's always going to be the human element. And this is where we talked about the final second shot with High Point University against Wisconsin, and how no AI system would have bet that a kid that didn't score a single basket is going to win the game for the whole team. So he said there's going to always be that heat check, in the moment. Heat checks will happen, and humans will overcome and flourish in those moments, which will be unable to be captured by AI or analytics. So that was really cool to talk about. So that concludes the entire season 1 of Sports Stories, the podcast. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I'm going to be continuing to do this next year as well. After all of my episodes, April 6th will drop the recap of every episode I've done, just so you can sort of see where it's going and where it's been. Please let me know if y'all have any questions or any thoughts about what sort of episodes you want me to do in the future. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next episode to drop. Thank you so much.